It is now my pleasure to address this group for the last time as its president. And I want to tell you that we meet in 2009, in November of 2009, at an extraordinary time in our society's history. I've been sort of keeping a mental note of the most frequent word I have heard at this conference, in the sessions I've been to and in the conversations I've heard. And I can tell you that word is evidence. We have done something in the last few years that has opened a door in a conversation about the idea of evidence in a way that has not existed previously in this society. I want to talk about that idea, the concept of evidence, and I want to talk about it in particular as it is, I think, a challenge to us as a society. In this moment of opportunity, we have a chance to accomplish some things as scientists who study crime and justice that we have been chafing at the bit to accomplish for a long time. But I worry that if we don't understand this time in our history correctly and we don't relate to it in the way that we need to, we will look back at this time period with regret. We will both underestimate what we could have done and overestimate what we already have done. So I want to use this moment to talk about this time that we have as a society and to challenge us to think about how we can use this moment to become more of what we are capable of being as a set of scholars interested in the problems of crime and justice. So what is this, this moment in time, this era of evidence-based criminology? Well, it has a lot of components and a lot of ideas behind it. On the one hand, we have a federal government that has broadly embraced the idea of science. Our president has made speeches before the National Academies of Science, the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Mental Health, and in each of these addresses, he has said how his administration will be an administration of evidence. And he has changed some websites of the federal government that used to hide the studies that scientists were paid by our tax dollars to produce, and put instead this evidence in the forefront so that our citizens can review what we know and think about the implications of what we know for what we do. I want to also say that the professional associations of the field of criminal justice have been thinking about evidence with as much enthusiasm as we are now thinking about it for quite some time. I regularly attend the Probation and Parole Association meetings, and people in this room go to the International Association of Chiefs of Police meetings and the PERF meetings and the American Corrections Association meetings, and they will tell you that at those meetings the word evidence is very prominently displayed. People are hungry to go to sessions in which somebody will talk about what we know about crime and justice issues. At the U.S. Department of Justice, by the way, Lori Robinson was confirmed, a member of this organization, was confirmed as the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Justice Programs last night. At her confirmation hearings, she announced the formation of an Office of What Works within the Office of Justice Programs to disseminate to hungry legislatures, state and local legislators, what we know about what works in the justice system on the basis of not just projects funded by the U.S. government, but also studies carried out by people our colleagues and other scholars of criminal justice. And then, of course, in our own field, in the field of criminology, we have a lot of evidence behind the idea of evidence, of this moment of evidence. We have invented a mini Nobel Peace Prize, the Stockholm Prize. The recipients of the Stockholm Prize are recognized for their contributions to our knowledge about the functions of crime and justice. I want to also point out that the Campbell collaboration, which has for a long time put out evidence about medical interventions and other kinds of studies in the social and behavioral sciences, has established a justice group that now has on its website 22 systematic reviews of crime and justice evidence that can tell you not only proudly some of the things we know about projects that are systematically effective, but just as importantly, something about what we know about approaches that do not work. By the way, I recommend you go to the website. It makes terrific reading. This society established the journal Criminology and Public Policy. I was the founding editor of that journal. We took this journal from 0 to 2, to the number 2 journal in the citation indices on criminal justice and crime in the world in barely its 4th edition. The journal Criminology and Public Policy is devoted to publishing studies that have policy relevance and to discussing the policy relevance of those studies. And the newest division of the American Society of Criminology is the Division on Experimental Criminology, which is a division devoted to carrying out experiments so that we can understand what works and what does not work. So within our own organization, we are a manifestation of this new era of evidence-based work. But my purpose in this talk is not only just to congratulate us for having arrived at this moment ready to take advantage of it, but my purpose is also to raise some friendly questions about this, about our stance in relation to this new time period. What is the nature of the opportunity here? What does it mean to be practicing the science of criminology in an era in which our constituency is hungry for evidence? What are the limits of the evidence that we are able to provide to them? Not only the limits of what we know, but the very limits of the idea of evidence as an idea. And I think most importantly, and this is to me, as a person who is leaving an office that I've had a chance to enjoy for a year, how do we organize ourselves as a group so that we do not look back at this moment in time with regret about the opportunities we have missed? My point is not to critique the evidence movement per se, because I am an enthusiastic participant in it and a devoted consumer of it. Instead, my purpose here is to ask 2 questions. In what way can evidence inform our most important policy challenges? What is it that we can use evidence to do from an important policy perspective? And secondly, what is the role of the American Society of Criminology in that evidence movement? In doing this, I want to coin a new phrase. This is a tongue twister, so it's not going to go anywhere past this talk. But I want to coin a new phrase, and that phrase is knowledge-based criminological action. Because I want to talk about us not as people who are just producing knowledge, but we are also producing action. Our agenda is in part an action agenda. Now, there are people who have grave doubts about that idea, and I'll talk about those doubts as well. And I share historically some of those same doubts. But instead of just the very narrow idea of evidence for knowledge about criminology, I want to propose to you that we think broadly also about a more important challenge, which is what is knowledge-based criminological action, and how much of that do we have, and how do we use it for action? Let's think first about the concept of evidence in criminology. Much has been made recently of the so-called gold standard. My friend David Weisberg, the most recent winner of the Stockholm Prize, who is a practitioner of the experimental methodology, doesn't like this phrase gold standard, and whenever he talks about methods, he always is careful to say calling this the gold standard is a little bit of a misnomer, but we use it as the gold standard, the idea of randomized field trials. And this is the idea that we will form our trials in the field and carry them out with random assignment to a treatment and a control condition, to a non-treatment condition, and we will compare the outcomes, and this will, over time, as we repeat these experiments, this will tell us what interventions work and what interventions do not work. This has led, I think, to a very strong interest in a what works model of policymaking. So when you think about what you hear policymakers say, and by the way, we had the current prosecutor from the city of Philadelphia come in here and talk about his desire as an elected official to have people like us help him understand what works so that he can put it into practice in his own work. This what works model of policymaking has derived largely from this broad, in my view, this broad idea that experiments carried out in field settings, carefully done and properly executed, can inform us about strategies that work and strategies that do not work. We've also seen I think Faye Taxman was telling me that she counts 140 meta-analyses that she counts in her work. We've seen the emergence of systematic reviews as an important new way to try to organize our thinking about the knowledge base for criminology. We are scientists, and we are careful to talk about the limitations of our work, and so one of the things that comes through very quickly is, of course, the limitations in the quality of the existing work. So whenever you do a meta-analysis, the first thing that happens is the studies that don't have controls or the studies that don't define variables or whatever come off the top, and you go from a number like 240 studies down to maybe 63 that match the criteria, and out of those you drop a few off. And so one of the things we always recognize at the outset is that when we are talking about criminological knowledge, we're talking about them from a point of view of limitations frequently on the quality of work contained in that knowledge base. And we also recognize that there are problems typically in both the size and the consistency of effects. So again, I recommend you go to the Campbell Collaboration website and look at those systematic reviews. And one of the more common patterns is that a review will talk about a handful of studies and one find a positive effect and some find a negative effect. And when you add them all up, you get a conclusion. But that conclusion derives from a set of studies. And if you have a pet theory, you can usually find a study that will confirm it. But I also want to call attention to what I see to be the core philosophical problem with a narrow what works definition of our evidence base. Now, no one in this room will make an argument, as I'm just about to make, that we are already doing everything we need to do. All we need to do is study closely what we do so we can see which of the things we do work, which of the things we do not work, so we can stop doing what doesn't work and start doing what does work. No one would agree with that statement. Now, of course we want to do that. Of course we want to do those, learn what we are doing that works and what does not work so we can inform our action, but no one would begin at the beginning point, which is we are already doing what we need to do. In its most narrow, radical version, the what works construction of the evidence base for criminology has an unstated assumption that we are now doing what we need to do and that nothing new needs to be done. I submit to you that that is wrong, and I hope to prove that in my remarks. So a narrow view of evidence, and by the way, most of the people, and I sent the earlier versions of this talk out to people who are in the evidence-based movement, proponents of the heavily involved in the Campbell collaboration and so on, and they all said to me, none of my colleagues believe what you just said, and that's the point. But I want to say our consumers believe what I just said. They often think that we are going to tell them what works on the basis of a set of evidence about a set of studies about what we have been doing for a while. And we have to be very careful that we don't mislead them to think that what we now know about what we now do is all we need to know about in order to be able to do what we need to do. Because that is an enormously conservative construction of our job. It is a belief in the past that is profoundly slavery to the past. It is backward-looking in its entire agenda. And it cannot lead us, in that way that I've narrowly constructed it, to a program of innovation that will take us out of the current morass into a new understanding of our relationship to the demands of justice. I'm going to use my own work in the area of the penal system as an example of what I'm talking about. I would argue that there are four major problems facing the penal system today. The first one is mass incarceration. The United States locks up 5 times the number of people it locked up per rate in 1972, and by far the most incarcerating nation in the world, among westernized democracies for sure. I want to argue the second most important problem facing the penal system today is reentry cycling. That is, people who leave the prison come back at very high rates. And people who leave once and come back once are very likely to leave again and come back again. So that we have an incarceration system that is composed very heavily of people who are cycling in and out of our communities. So that when you read the studies that show high rates of incarceration at the community level, they'll often say, 20% of the males are locked up on any given day. But that's not really the story. That is the story. Every male who lives in this community will be locked up at some time. And on any given day, 20% are locked up. And tomorrow, 20% will be locked up. It'll be a different group. Some people will be back in, and some people will be back out again. when Dina Rose and I did interviews in Tallahassee with residents, about 100 interviews in 2 high incarceration neighborhoods, we asked the question, has a member of your family been locked up in the prison system in the last 5 years? This is when it first hit us, because every single person we talked to answered that question yes, including the former mayor of Tallahassee, a black woman, including the reverend of the AME Baptist Church on the Hill, and the president of the Tallahassee Urban League. We also recognize that programming is ineffective. It's ineffective in 2 ways. It is ineffective in the traditional way that we do a lot of things with people that don't work, and it is ineffective in another more profound way in that we do a lot of nothing with people. That is, most people who have problems never have those problems even thought about or addressed while they're in our care. And finally, I think we face a profound challenge in the penal system about skill deficits. Most of the people we hire to carry out the functions of justice in the penal system have limited skills for doing so. So the question is, what does the What Works literature tell us about these 4 policy problems? Now, I don't want to say evidence, because I'm going to talk later about evidence. I'm talking about the narrow construction of evidence that we have done a bunch of studies that tell us what works and what does not work. On the issue of skill deficits, I want to say that there's not to my knowledge, there's not a single controlled trial of a training program, skill development program in the field of corrections, to my knowledge. Now, there may be some out there, and my guess is, afterwards, Professor Farrington will tell me about 3 of them. But the point is, there's no enormous body of literature. He just told me about one study that I wasn't aware of in the men's room, by the way. So there's not this enormous body of literature out there that will inform us about how to, from a What Works perspective, about how to overcome an enormous deficit of skills among the people who deliver penal services in our system. On the question of ineffective programming, this is where a What Works agenda can tell us the most. There are programs listed in the Campbell Collaboration systematic reviews that have average estimated reductions in recidivism rates of 50%. 50%. If we did these programs on a matter of scale and they had anything like that impact, you can imagine the kind of impact they would have overall. But part of ineffective programming is how few people get programs. Again, Faye Taxman's research shows that about 11% of the people who go to prison with a major need have experience a treatment program for meeting that need. And so if ineffective programming is a matter of scale, we have to figure out a way of increasing our programming by 800%. And I want to tell you, there's not a single controlled experiment out there that will answer the question, how do you increase the resources available for the correction system by 800%? Reentry cycling is an issue on which there is the What Works movement has very good literature for us to think about. Most of the studies, by the way, tell us what doesn't work, which is kind of a disappointment. But there are studies out there that help us understand things we can do with people who are reentering our communities from the prison system. But the reentry cycling problem is only about half the problem of effective programs, and it's about half the problem of bad policies. Nationally, about 40% of the people who return to prison because of failure to abide by the rules of community supervision, not by a new arrest. And the failure to abide by rules of community supervision has, I would argue, just about as much to do with the rules of community supervision as it does about the behavior itself. And we don't have a single controlled experiment to tell us about rules of community supervision. And then finally, the topic I want to spend my most time, so my general point here is to say that the four most pressing problems of penal policy in the United States, the What Works literature narrowly confined to this narrow idea, which by the way, nobody in this room agrees with, but most of the rest of the world thinks this is what we're doing. The narrow idea that we're going to test systematically what we do in the field so that we can tell you what works and what doesn't work, the answer to that question doesn't help us with these 4 policy problems very much. What about mass incarceration? What about knowledge about mass incarceration? Let me suggest to you that we know a lot about mass incarceration from recent studies of mass incarceration in the United States. First of all, we know that it concentrates enormously among the poor. The generating idea behind justice reinvestment is the idea that the correction system, the penal system, is a concentrated intervention into poor communities. Eric Schlosser today in his opening comments for the plenary panel said that the biggest investment in public housing for poor people in the United States has been the expansion of the prison system. We also know that it exacerbates inequality. My friend Bruce Western's book, Punishment and Inequality, which won an award from this society last year, is an extraordinary tale about how incarceration deepens, strengthens, and widens the gap between whites and blacks, especially young black men, especially young black men who come from poor neighborhoods. We know that it exacerbates poverty. We know this from studies of the economic prospects of going to prison. We know this from studies of a couple of economists at Villanova University about the relationship between the growth of the prison system and the occurrence of entrenched poverty nationally. We know that it drives intergenerational criminality. Murray and Farrington have done a series of studies which have been extremely informative about how the role incarceration plays in affecting the lives of children of parents who go to prison. And we know that it costs a lot of money. We also know what Jim Austin and I have been calling the iron law of prison populations. That is that what makes a prison population grow is two things: how many people go in and how long they stay. We know this because we've been messing with a lot of the other variables. What kinds of treatment programs we provide, whether we provide maximum security or medium security or minimum security, whether we put people in for a long time or a short. What we know is that the size of the prison population is produced by how many people go in and how long they stay. What we also know from studies done by people like Alan Beck and his colleagues and Al Bloomsing and his colleagues is that we have systematically varied those across time. So for a while we just grew the prison population because we made more people eligible. For a while we grew it because we increased the rate in which people, given a conviction of a felony, you went to prison. And recently we've been growing it on the basis of given that you're going to prison, we're going to make you stay there longer. I want to back up and make a point about that list of knowledge about mass incarceration and just tell you that this knowledge is profoundly important about mass incarceration. You cannot think about the solutions to mass incarceration without embracing this information, and yet there's not a single controlled experiment in that knowledge base. When you ask the question, what works, you cannot answer the policy problem, what do you want to do about mass incarceration? Because you have to ask a different question. And you have to engage a different kind of knowledge, and you have to engage a different kind of understanding of how the criminal justice system has intervened into the policy world we live in. Let me talk for a minute about mass incarceration as an experiment. Now, it is clearly not an experiment. We didn't say, hey, we're going to try this in Kentucky but not in Illinois. Although some economists have treated it as sort of a natural experiment, so they try to compare the differences across states because states incarcerated at different levels, and some states have clearly incarcerated differently than other states. And Natasha Frost has shown in her work that while the entire penal system in the United States grew and every state's prison system grew, states grew their prison systems in different ways at different times. So some states grew by how many people went in. Some states grew by length of stay, and some states, the big kahuna, they did both. But it's useful to think of this as an experiment, to say that somewhere around the late 1970s, we decided we were going to try to deal with the problem of crime as a public policy problem, not necessarily as a public safety problem, but as a public policy problem by incarcerating more people. So if you look at a graph of the incarceration rate in the United States, the first year it grows is 72. It has grown every year since 1972. Every single year since 1972, a generation of incarceration growth, both rate and numbers, during good times and bad, times of war, times of peace, when the bubble of young men eligible for incarceration was expanding and when that bubble was contracting. We had the policy idea that no matter what was going on with the polity, with crime, with the social system, with the economy, with our international relations, we would grow the prison system. That was the experiment. One of the things we have learned by looking at this experiment, I'm talking very much about some papers that were delivered today in the plenary session on incarceration effects. One of the things we've learned is that the prison has little deterrent power in the sense that it is not a very, as a punishment, does not have a lot of celerity. That is, it takes a long time to impose a very stiff prison sentence. The length of stay has almost no relationship to the likelihood of recidivism, essentially a zero relationship with the likelihood of recidivism. We also now know that prison is a poor setting for treatment. If you want to have a treatment effect, do the treatment program anywhere but in a prison, and you'll have about twice or 3 times the level of effect if it's an effective program. That is, if you decide you want to do what we know works in a prison setting, you're reducing its capacity to produce changes by about half to a third to 2/3. We now know that prison imposes enormous collateral damages on the individuals who go through the system, on their families, and on their children. I want to talk about an epidemiologist at the University of North Carolina, Jim Thomas, whose work shows that in neighborhoods that have high incarceration rates and people are cycling through the prison system at high rates, the result has been to increase rates of HIV, AIDS, chlamydia, syphilis, and gonorrhea for the women who live in those neighborhoods who never go to prison, and also the rate of teenage births for those same women. And we've also produced this enormous incentive structure that is an impediment to doing anything about it. So here's the deal we have now. If a judge decides it is wise to take a chance on a person and keep that person in the community instead of sending that person to prison, and that judge is right, and that judge made a wise decision, someone else gets the benefits. If that judge is wrong and made a bad decision, the judge gets the costs. If a community says, we're going to accept offenders back into our midst, people who've broken the law back into our midst from prison, and we're going to create a place where they can adjust, and we're going to try to do a good job of having our family members make it here, and they are wrong, they get all the costs. If they are right, other people get the benefits. No business person in his or her right mind would open a business in an environment where someone else gets the benefits if you're a success, and if you're a failure, you get all the costs. In fact, it's a wonder that any judge sends anybody to any place but prison. It's a wonder that parole officers keep people on their caseloads. You know, the idea that we have grown the prison system in this current incentive structure is baffling to the mind. I have to laugh. So the state of Arizona is considering the way they're going to try to reduce prison costs is to privatize the entire prison system, creating thereby the strongest possible economic incentive for growing the prison system out in the private sector they could possibly do. And finally, we know that the context of the community into which a person is released is important. Recent papers on poverty, on inequality, on housing, on the availability of services, all show that people who are paroled into communities that have greater community strengths do better on the average than people who are paroled into communities that are weaker. Now I want to say again, now you know my mantra, there's been no controlled experiments producing any of this knowledge. This is not a what works knowledge base. This is a knowledge about what we have done, what our policy has produced. I also then want to talk a little bit about mass incarceration, crime, and evidence, because the big question, of course, is you grow the prison system by a factor of 5, what does it do to crime? And on this one, of course, there are, again, no controlled experiments, but there are lots of attempts to try to estimate the effect taking advantage of various methods. And there is a kind of a consumer's array of possible studies. If you really want a big effect, there are studies out there showing that everybody you lock up prevents 287 crimes every year that person's locked up. If you like a medium effect, there are some studies out there showing it prevents about maybe 28 to 30 crimes per person. You want a small effect? Well, there's a few studies out there showing that every person you lock up produces more crimes. So in a consumer's array like this, you want a result, you pick one. This is one of the problems, by the way, with the non-experimental evidence. And one of the reasons we have as a society embraced the experimental model is that we're trying to nail down what we know about things. And if we now say some things don't make themselves easily amenable to the idea of a controlled field trial, then we're asking for the importance of interpretation and understanding and integration of studies. So let's take Bill Spellman's number. Let's take it as an example. Bill Spellman estimates that about 25% of the drop in crime since the early 1990s, of the prison increase since the early 1990s, has been due to the prison increase. The rest has been due to other factors, social factors, whatever, but about 1/4 of it has been directly attributable to more people being behind bars. Does that say the experiment worked? And you cannot answer that question from that point of view, because it has this hidden counterfactual that none of us would accept, that that if we didn't decide to grow the prison system, we would have done nothing else. We would have had no other policy response, right? So the hidden, unstated idea behind that study about whether it worked or not is an implausible social reality. We would not have stood for that. Now, we might have built schools, we might have invested in community infrastructure, we might have done a lot of other things with that $100 billion we instead spent building prisons. So even if you accept and by the way, Spellman's work is extremely good, convincing to me, and I think highly credible with state-of-the-art methods. Even if you accept that number as being the right number, it doesn't answer for you the question, was it the right policy? To answer the policy question, you have to ask a lot of more questions, and you have to work with this evidence more carefully than a what works framework enables you to do. So there's plenty of debate about the right number, but there can be no debate about the problem that right number is not going to answer even the question it's designed to answer. So a few minutes ago, we gave to a group of imaginative reformers an award for justice reinvestment. So I want to talk now about justice reinvestment as a response to mass incarceration. What enlivens me to think about justice reinvestment as a reform idea is that it's precisely responsive to the kinds of evidence that mass incarceration has given us as a problem. First of all, it's responsive to the iron law. It deals with the problem of too many people, that prison populations are produced by how many people go in and how long they stay by doing two things, having fewer people there and having them stay less time. It is not sort of working with smoke and mirrors. It is saying, you're behind bars now, we're going to bring you out. Secondly, it changes the incentive structure. Currently, a community would have no reason to have higher rates of return, because one of the things we know is there's a linear relationship between the number of people returning to your community from prison and your crime rate in the following year. So why would you want to have more people coming back? Well, the answer is they're going to come back anyway, right? That's Jeremy Travis's answer. But there's another answer, and a more profound one, which is to say we are going to, instead of investing the money in prisons, we're going to invest the money in you. You get to keep the people who are your residents, but you also get to get the investment we're willing to make in them. I'll say it another way. In a session before this, we looked at a map of Brooklyn in which Eric Cadora had mapped incarceration rates and expenditure rates at block by block in the city of Brooklyn. There were maps in which $3 million was spent on an individual block, locking up residents of that block in a single year. Now, I want to say that what that really represents is people who live on Park Avenue giving money to people who live in Auburn, New York, to watch people who live in Brooklyn for 2 years and then send them back worse. Justice reinvestment is the idea that we're willing to spend the money, let's spend it on something else. And if the communities are getting the money, but the money is tied to keeping the people, and keeping the people is tied to keeping them crime-free, then the incentive structure is suddenly realigned so that people now are no longer making profits for others, but they're making profits for themselves. It changes the locus of public safety from some kind of abstract public safety agenda carried out by public agencies to the informal social control networks of communities. In other words, it takes advantage of what we know, that community context is so powerfully important in the public safety agenda. Rob Sampson and his colleagues have shown us that communities differ in their capacity to deal with the problems that lead to crime and crime-related problems. Justice reinvestment is the belief that we have an interest in investing in those communities so their capacities can be changed. So what we are doing is we're trying to take money that we are currently willing to commit to what is really a low productivity outcome, incarceration, to a high productivity outcome, communities. And what is the evidence about this? One of the things we know is that length of stay has no relationship to recidivism rates. So if currently our length of stay has about doubled since the early 70s. If we went back to the length of stay we had before we doubled it, we would still have the same recidivism rate. We would just have half the people locked up. Because as you recall from the iron law, the prison population is reduced by how many people go there and how long they stay. If you have them stay half as long, you get half the prison population, same recidivism rate. We also are taking advantage of what we know about informal social control, that stronger communities and stronger community networks will produce lower rates of crime. We are taking advantage of what we know about community context and what it is that helps people. So if we're investing in resource infrastructures that people who are reentering from prison can take advantage of when they return from prison, we are strengthening their chances of adjusting to the community. And we're taking advantage of what we know about prison population dynamics, and the best way to keep mass incarceration down is to not put people in prison. So that's what I mean when I say knowledge-based criminological action. I don't mean a series of controlled field trials that tell us what to do in the what works sense, but what I say is that we as criminologists know a few things about what we have done about the penal system. Let us use this knowledge to create new solutions to the problems that we have produced by our current policy structure. Let us innovate. Let us not be captured by the past, but let us use what we know to create a new future. For the American Society of Criminology, I think this suggests to us three kinds of obligations. I want to suggest that, first of all, there are things that we must do. We must do. Then I'm going to suggest there are things that we ought to do. And then I'm going to suggest there are some things that we should organize ourselves so that we can do. What we must do. This is our core work. First of all, as the American Society of Criminology needs to organize itself to grow the size and scope of funding for research on crime and justice problems in the United States. If we share any interest whatsoever, we must share an interest in increasing our capacity to generate more knowledge. Now, I understand that there are many questions people ask. You know, the state controls the knowledge agenda. We need to work on that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. That not all the studies produce consistent knowledge. But the point about this is to the extent there is a broader pot of support for growing what we know about criminologically relevant action, those actions will themselves be based more on what we know, and a debate about the meaning of what we know will enable us to engage in more purposeful action. We also need to situate ourselves so that we can help the federal government understand the crime and justice agenda. One of the things that's become clear to me is that crime and justice in the United States, the research function of crime and justice in the United States, is dominated by the four-year election cycle. But knowledge is not a four-year agenda. What we need to do is to say we can help the federal funding infrastructure engage in a long-term agenda to try to grow our knowledge about crime and justice issues in a way that is systematically improving what we know and answering the most important questions we face. And if we've seen anything in the last few years, it is that as a new White House comes into office, it changes what we believe to be the important questions. But the questions didn't change, the political structure changed. In almost all the other sciences, there is an organized advising structure of the people who are the scientists in setting the agenda. Mental health, economics, housing, and it must also be true in justice. It must also be true in justice. So these are the core things we must do. We must work to grow the size of the pot, the independence of the pot, the amount of the pot that is devoted to investigator-initiated research rather than congressionally identified research topics, and we must also guarantee that there is a way in which that pot is responsive to the field of criminologists who are themselves trying to understand the important and profound problems of crime and justice. That's what we must do. And if we do not do that, we will look back at this moment with regret. Here's what we ought to do. We ought to engage in directed systematic policy work on particular policy questions. Now, I know this is tricky business, but there are two kinds of places in which we are naturally called to be active and in which we are essentially absent. One of these has to do with court cases. Frequently, the United States Supreme Court is asked to decide questions on which it relies upon an interpretation of criminological evidence. And we let them do this, let their law clerks do this, without having a word to say about what we believe to be good evidence, bad evidence, and the criteria for what we would consider to be convincing evidence. We should organize ourselves as a society to write amicus curiae briefs on evidence-related issues when the Supreme Court is asking questions that are going to decide policy issues about law in the United States, when at stake is what we know about crime and justice as a foundation for those policies. We also should be in a position to take positions on legislation when that legislation raises questions about evidence on which we are able to take a position. Now, I understand no one knows yet how we would do this, and so we would have to organize ourselves to do this. We have to think carefully about how we would do this. But if we let legislation continue to be proposed when claims are being made about what we know as a foundation for that evidence, and we don't comment on those claims, then we are being silent in the face of what we know. And we will regret it. And then I'm going to do the most controversial one. I'm going to say this is what we should find a way to do. So the first core work we must do, the second policy work we ought to do, and the third is something I think we should find a way to do. This will be very hard for us. And that is we ought to find a way to express our values. I have imagined situations in which three things are true. One, there is a policy-related problem at which human suffering is at stake. Two, there is existing evidence about that policy problem which, if put into place, would reduce human suffering. And three, if we took a position on that evidence in relation to that policy problem, suffering would be lessened. If those three things are true, on what moral basis could we remain silent? Now, I understand a society like ours will have a profoundly affecting debate to decide if all three principles apply. And it's not a majority vote problem, it's not a minority rule problem, it's not a board problem, but it's a problem that us as a collective set of citizens, producers and consumers of justice, in situations where we have the capacity through what we know to have impact on human suffering, remaining silent is not excusable. So I would say to us, we should find a way as a society to become active on those kinds of issues. So the challenge to the ASC is that. How do we take advantage of this moment in time? How do we go beyond a narrow construction that we're often called upon to bring to the table of what works to a broader construction of what we know and how it tells us we should engage in action? Now, I realize that the question is, of course, in a society such as ours, there's a broad range of differing opinion about a wide range of issues. For every person who believes that the death penalty does not work, there's somebody else who believes it does. For everyone who thinks we should do life without parole, there's someone who thinks we should not, and on and on and on. I mean, I've been in this business long enough to know that on almost any policy-related problem, there are at least 3 points of view represented in the audience here. So it's not going to be easy for us to do these kinds of things and to do it carefully in a way that respects academic freedom and the freedom of inquiry. But realistically, what are our choices? The evidence we produce will either be used or it will not. That is, the things we have to say about what we know is true will either have an impact on the actions taken by people in relation to justice, or it will not. Either we will help to shape how that evidence is understood by those who are taking action, or we will not. That is, either we will be active in trying to say to people, this is what our knowledge tells us about justice-relevant action, or we will remain mute and action will be taken. In either case, there will be mistakes made. In either case, there will be problems that arise. Debates, messy. The political process is an inordinately messy one. But for us, it seems to me the choice is really straightforward. We either accept the obligation of our chosen profession, which is to try to do something about the quality of justice in the world in which we live, or we say it is not our job. How will we look back at the tasks we undertook for ourselves in the era that we find ourselves in? Thank you. That is not the last thing you'll hear from me, but that is the last thing you'll hear from me as president of this society. I want to invite Rick Rosenfeld up.
He set the bar pretty high. As my first official act as president of the American Society of Criminology, I hereby adjourn this meeting and invite us next door to eat and drink.